Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It is that time. So, hello everyone. My name is Kenzie Dodds, and I'm going to talk with you about ES6 modules and give you a little bit more than you want to know. This is going to be a lightning fast talk, and that's why I have the lightning bolts there. So just prepare. If you look down to look at your phone, you're going to miss something. Before we get started though, we're going to do something together really quick. Everybody please stand up. So if you're physically able, you can join us. If you're not, that's totally fine. But put your hands out in front of you like this and squat down like that and back up. This is called an air squat. We're going to do 12 of these together. Okay, ready? And count out loud. Ready? Go. 1, 2. We're waking up. 3, 4. Feeling great. 5, 6, 5. Just kidding. 7, 8, 9. Almost there. 10. 11, oh, one more, 12. Okay, before you sit down, stretch up as high as you can, and higher as you can't go any higher, and then stretch even higher than that. All right, now lean over to the one side and feel the stretch in your side, and it feels awesome, and you're like, oh man, I haven't done this in a long time. Stretch over the other side. Okay, great. Before you sit down, I want you to turn to your neighbor, introduce yourself, and thank them for coming. All right, you can go ahead and take a seat. Thank you very much for indulging me. So I like to do that before my talks just to calm me down. And if you get nothing out of my talk, at least you met somebody and you got some exercise. So that's the goal. And it also wakes everybody up because it's been a long day of conferencing. So here's the origin story for this talk. A couple months ago, I was realizing how much there is about the syntax for ES6 modules, and said I could give a 20 to 30 minute talk on ES6 modules. Unfortunately, like it's that, like there's that much there. And Ryan Florence responded, I could give an entire conference, ES6 modules conf. And then Matt Zbyszki's like, careful, we actually, like, this happened. We created a conference based off tweets like this. So I don't think that there's going to be an ES6 modules conf, but yeah. So here's some expectations for you. Feel free to get up and leave if this isn't what you're expecting. I'm going to give a brief history about modules in JavaScript, and we're going to spend the bulk of the time exploring the ES6 modules standard and syntax. Most of this will probably be relevant to you at some point, but some of it will be kind of like, what? I don't know if that's really relevant. But that's the whole idea. Is like we're going to get a comprehensive look at ES6 modules. There's nothing that's in the ES6 module spec that you will not see today, as far as I'm aware. So we'll see lots and lots of code. And it's mostly going to be practical. Okay, so just as an intro to modules, I can stand up for this part. For lots of this, I'll be sitting down and looking at code. But a module is like a chapter in a book. So you have, if we're thinking about like a science or like a chemistry book for school, a chapter 10 might have dependencies on chapter 3 and 5. Like there might be some contextual information that you need to know from those chapters to understand what chapter 10 is trying to teach you. Likewise, chapter 15 might depend on chapter 10, and so chapter 10 has dependence, so it's setting up some context for you to learn more about these other chapters as well. And modules are very much the same kind of concept, and it's not like this concept of modules isn't unique to JavaScript, absolutely not. Yeah, lots of other languages have this concept of modules. But that's basically the idea of modules that we're trying to accomplish here, trying to encapsulate logic in a way that our brains can understand it. Because quite honestly, we could write our entire JavaScript program in a single file, and for a long time, many people did that. And it totally works. I have an app that's been running in production for a long time that's a single file. But as an application grows, it becomes more difficult for us to trace dependencies in our minds with a giant file like that. So we split it out and tried to encapsulate some logic. So here is a history on modules in JavaScript. When JavaScript was first created, there was no concept of a module system, and so we kind of made one up. We made this immediately invoked function expression. Don't forget the semicolon because some hipsters might mess you up. But Yeah, it's actually funny that I say that because I forgot a semicolon right there. But I don't actually use semicolons. So, haha, I use a linter instead. So, yeah, so this is basically how you do it. Is you'd have your global variable, whether you're in Node or in the browser. In Node, it doesn't matter because we have CommonJS, but in the browser, and you just stick stuff onto a global variable in the browser. So here we're putting a subtract function onto the global, but we depend on this add function. That dependency is implicit. There's nothing in this module that says I depend on this add function. You just have to know that that add module has to be in existence in the browser before you load up this subtract module. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time. So yeah, there were some obvious challenges with this, and so we came up with this AMD syntax, and require.js was kind of the champion of this. And so you have this explicitness here where you say, I explicitly depend on the add module. So before you load me, go load that and all of its dependencies. Once that's all done, then load me, and here's my function to get me, me as a module. So it will pass along any of the dependencies to that module, and then you return that module. So this actually was a pretty solid solution. When you would go to deploy to production, you would want to concatenate all these files together, so you're not doing a bunch of asynchronous calls to get this stuff. But it worked pretty well for a long time. And then finally, CommonJS, something that most of you are probably more familiar with from Node, the Node ecosystem. It can't do the asynchronous module loading like AMD could, but you can bundle it and make it like with a bundler like Webpack or something, and make it work with asynchronous stuff. But it's the same idea. You can require things explicitly and then use those things. And yeah, so that's kind of the major module styles that we've had in JavaScript. But now we have an actual standard that's language and syntax based with the advent of ES6. The problem is they're not like, yes, they exist. The syntax is defined, but loading them is not. So that's the problem that we are faced with today. So lucky for us, we have a transpiler. So TypeScript or Babel can transpile the syntax down to a different style module. Most commonly CommonJS, but you can have it transpiled to AMD or even UMD as well, which is something totally different. And then you can load this in the browser. Or like you can bundle it and load it in the browser or use it in Node. So that's what we're going to do today to learn about the syntax. We're going to see a lot of transpiled code. Just be cautious of like learning the spec from transpiled code. Often they're doing some optimizations that might trick you up. So yeah, just want to put that in there. Okay, from here on out, it's a lot of code. So enjoy. Here is the most basic. We're going to start with exports, and then we'll go to imports. So this is the most basic. Oh, and by the way, I'll have a link to my slides at the end of the slide deck, so you can look at all these examples later. But yeah, we'll start with exports, we'll go to imports, and then we'll kind of do a mesh of the two. So this is the basic idea. We have a function called add, and we want this function to be available to other modules. And so we're going to say we want to export it, and we want this export to be the default export, so that when somebody imports us, this is the function that they get. Over here on the right side is the CommonJS version of that. Babel will transpile that down to CommonJS. I'm not going to explain all the tricky things that it's doing to make things interop properly, but you have in CommonJS, you have this exports, and it's going to stick a default property on that and assign it to the thing that you're exporting. So then you can do named exports. So you can export anything. It can be a const declaration, or it can be a function, or just an existing variable. But here we're saying export this const variable that I'm assigning to bar. And then because I'm not saying default, it's going to be a named export, and the name will be the name of the variable, so foo. So when people want to import me, and we'll look more closely at the imports later, but they can pull that that foo property off of that module. And so yeah, that's just going to tack it onto the exports object, just like that. And something kind of important to note here is you'll notice it is still declaring a variable, and that's because even though I'm exporting it, I have this special keyword in front of here. I can still use foo right here, and that works just fine. So that's why we're like creating, or we're adding foo to exports, and we're creating the variable. So then you can do more than one in a single file. So here we have a subtract function, and we have a now equals new date, which is preventing JavaScript from being purely functional. So we tack on this export in front of both of those, and now those are each named exports that you can pull out. You can pull out one or both of them when you're using other modules. Yeah, and then you can combine these named exports and defaults. So here we are just tacking on the export to the subtract and the export to now. And then we're doing an export default of this object. And here we don't actually have to create a variable name, and because that's because it's the default export. So it doesn't need a name, because when people are importing it, they're not going to be importing it by name. They just import the default, and they can call it whatever they want. And so here we'll see this imports a little bit closer later, but they can import that. If we wanted to be able to use this object, then we could create this as a variable, chewy, and then we could export chewy. So now we can use chewy in our module. So that's totally legit. So then we can do these as a list. And this is actually the way that I prefer to export or do my exports in my modules, is have a single place in the whole file that does all of the exporting. So I pretty much only have one export keyword in the whole file. The nice thing about, or the reason that I like to do that is because it makes it easier for people to come into the file and know everything that's available from that module. They don't have to search around the file. They just find where the export is. They see everything that's available, the whole public interface to this module. And it looks kind of like you're creating an object here with the new enhanced object literals that we have with ES6. This is not an object. Don't fool yourself into thinking it is, because that tripped me up and it made me cry. So to avoid tears, don't think of this as an object. And we'll actually see some special syntax that'll kind of help solidify that in your mind. But actually, looking back here at the CommonJS version of this, we're just going to tack on add, subtract, and life and universe to the exports variable in our CommonJS version. So we can alias the things that we're exporting. So if you wanted to be really, really mean and get everybody on your team to really not like you, then you could export add as subtract and subtract as add. And when people are importing things, they're like, what? This looks like it's subtracting, but it's called add. So yeah, this is like some more evidence. This is not an object. This is very like specific module syntax. And so we say export whatever it is that we want to export. In this case, it's the add function as whatever the name we want it to have. This can be really useful if you, inside of your module, a certain function name makes more sense, but you want to expose a different function by that same name. Yeah, I've definitely used this a time or two. It's a pretty useful feature to be able to alias your exports. You can actually export something with the name of default, and that is functionally equivalent to using export default. So here we have subtract and the now that we had before, and we're doing an export of lists. And then for chewy, we're saying export chewy as default. So it looks like it's a name, but it's actually functionally equivalent to this chewy. So, cool. So now so you have now seen almost everything there is to know about exports. There's a couple other things we're going to look at later. Now on the import side of things. So you can actually import a module and just import this thing. I would say that if this is in your code, you're probably doing something wrong. And that's because what this is saying is this thing needs to be loaded into the environment, and it's going to do some weird things, and I don't know what those things are. And so like that would be a code smell to me. Avoid doing this. But what that translates down to is just a require statement. Pretty simple. Then you can import the default. So here, if we have a cool cats module, that is exporting this array, Ben, Lesh, and Brian Holt, 2 cool cats, then we can import those and call that array whatever we want. It can be cats, it can be dogs, it can be whatever you want it to be. And then you can reference that inside of your module. And then you can import named exports. So in here we have this math module, and we're exporting an add and subtract. Then in kind of a very similar syntax, we can import add and subtract. We can import one or both of them, like whatever we need from that module, and then use those by the names that they're given. The important thing to note here is that they have to be referenced the exact same name as they were being exported. That's how it knows what function to give to you. In the case of default, it doesn't matter because syntax like that binding is syntax. But in the case of an import specifier like this, you have to specify exactly what you're importing. All right, so then on the alias imports, so let's say that your coworker was the terrible troll that they were, and they renamed, or the alias add is subtract and subtract is add. You could rename them back in your module and use them properly. So here you can say, okay, I want to bring in add, and I'm going to alias that to subtract and subtract as wat, just because that's fun. And then you can reference, you use your alias inside of your module. So here we're using wat. So like the whole troll situation is just to be funny. Like that's not really a good use case for something like this. A good use case for this, though, is if you have multiple modules that have 2 functions or exports that have the same name. Without being able to alias them, it would be impossible to include them in the same file. And so, yeah, you need to, like in that scenario, you would need to alias those things. So I've definitely done this a couple times. Or actually, another common use case for something like this is if like there's the offline plugin for Webpack, and you import something, a function called runtime or something like that. Runtime doesn't really make a lot of sense in my module, and so I'm going to alias that as offline runtime, so that like when I'm seeing the variable name in my file, it makes a lot more sense to me. So being able to rename things to have them make a little bit more sense in your module is kind of a nice feature. Here's something, this is definitely in the more than you wanted to know category. This is kind of a useless feature, but it totally works. You can import and then import specifier default from a module, but then you can't actually do anything with default because it's a keyword. So like you couldn't invoke it, you couldn't like console log it, you can't do anything with it. So like that's not really worth too much. But I think the reason that it works is because you can alias it. And so we can have this import specifier, and you can say import default as animals. So like I can only see myself doing that if I actually can't see myself doing that. To be perfectly honest, this is how I would do it. If I wanted to like import several things from this thing, I would say, okay, import the default thing, and then I'm going to specify a couple things like foo and bar, and have those 2 things be separate. But if I really wanted to have them be the same, or like inside of that import specifier bracket stuff, then I could do it that way. So these 2 are functionally equivalent. And one thing that I didn't mention when we started talking about the imports is what Babel is doing over here. I'm not going to run through the code because that would take too long. But basically what it's trying to do is because we can't actually load these imports and right now in any environment as far as I'm aware, we have to do some special munging to make CommonJS and ES6 modules work nicely together. So that's what this is all about. This interop require default is responsible for taking a required module and checking whether or not it it was transpiled ES6 modules and dealing with that versus just like straight up ES or CommonJS modules. So don't worry yourself too much about that. Just know that it works and it's magic. But we don't like magic, do we? No, just kidding. I don't like magic either. Okay, so now we can also, like I actually just barely showed you this, you can have named and default, and this is the way that I prefer to do things if I'm going to be pulling out both a default and a couple named properties, is you have the default, and then you have a comma, and then you list out your import specifiers. Pretty positive that it works this way too. Maybe not. Apparently not. I never do it that way, so yeah, don't do that way. Cool, so then you can import all the things. I've got like 10 minutes left, I think we'll be good. So I've actually done this a couple of times. This can be pretty useful. So here we have this animals module. It's exporting animals as default and random cat and add cat. Let's say that I just wanted to have all of those things, regardless of what they're called, like I just want them all. So that's where you get this import star. So you can import everything, and I want to, so I'm basically getting an object that has all of those things, and then I'm going to give it a name. So I can call it whatever I like. In this case, I call it all animals. And all of the named exports will just be properties by that name on that object. The default export will be on a default property on that object. So here we have all animals.default, and we also have all animals.randomCat and add cat. And then we have export star. So this actually, I don't use this a whole lot, but it is pretty darn useful in some scenarios. So let's say, here's a use case. Let's say you have a folder with a bunch of utility modules in there. Like you have a math module, and you have a drawing module, and you have like a bunch of different utility modules that are all exporting named exports themselves. And then you want to be able to just import everything from that folder. So you could make like an index.js file in there that says, okay, like for each one of these files, I'm just going to export everything that they export. Just forward those exports on. And so that's where the export star comes in. So here we have an other module that's exporting a const called foo, and another other module that's exporting a const called bar. And then I can just say export everything that's coming from those two modules. And then when people are importing this module, they can import the things that were exported from those. So you're just forwarding on exports. A couple of interesting things about this. If there is a default export from one of these modules, that will be ignored. So when you export star, you're not including a default export because it doesn't really have a name. So like there's, without some fancy additional syntax to be able to name what the default export would be, you can't really do that. And then it goes in as far as like name conflicts, the one that's last wins. So yeah, some important pieces to note. If you do want to export the default from a module, though, that is possible, and you could combine these strategies. But here you'd say export braces default, and that would say, okay, whatever is the default export from say hi, I want to make that the default export for my module and forward that on. And this is where I think, yeah.
If you go back to that start. So if you do that default, then you put the start behind it.
So like star right there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that you can combine these strategies. Yeah, as far as I know. If you wanted to, like, I know it's more typing, which is sad, but actually I kind of forgot to mention, and I should mention, one of the goals of ES6 modules, and one of the things that might make you be kind of sad at first, is that ES6 modules should be totally static. So there's no dynamic nature of ES6 modules. This is sad for some reasons, especially if you've done a lot of like dynamic requires and module exports and stuff. It can feel constraining, and that's exactly what it is. Functional programming is the same way. It constrains you to a certain set of principles, and then holy moly, my application is so much easier for me to think about. So in the same way, ES6 modules constrains us syntactically by saying everything must be statically analyzable, and that allows us to do a lot of cool things. One of those things is tree shaking. How many people have heard of tree shaking before? So tree shaking is this really awesome idea that says, if I can statically analyze everything that's being imported and exported, if I import one of the named exports from this module, then I don't need anything else in that module, so I can throw everything else away. And so you can really cut down on how much code you're shipping to the browser by doing this code analysis and removing the stuff that's not being used. And another benefit is static code analysis. And so there's this really awesome ESLint plugin that allows that will look at your imports and determine based off of those imports whether you're importing something that's not being exported. So if I had a typo, for example. Or if you're like looking for a file that doesn't exist and stuff. It's called ESLint plugin import, and it's fantastic, and I recommend you install it right now. Not right now. No, don't do it right now. 1 second. Internet's not that good. Yeah. So the static nature of ES6 modules is in some ways disappointing, but in most ways fantastic. Okay. Yeah. So I actually this is kind of to help explain what this interop required default function is doing. I don't think that I do have a little bit of time left, but I don't think that I'm going to jump into it because it would take a little bit more time than I have. So yeah, let me just wrap up with a couple of things. You now know everything that is in the ES6 module specification as far as syntax for ES6 modules. Congratulations. So here, this is a link to a blog post that I wrote when Babel upgraded from version 5 to version 6. It was a real painful thing for the community because there were some really significant breaking changes. Not the least of which was they fixed a bug that many people depended on. So here's what it was. For a lot of my stuff, what I would do is I'd have an object that I'd just like stick a bunch of stuff on, and then I would export that object as the default. And then in Babel version 5, I could import and provide an import specifier to pull out properties off of that object. And this is invalid ES6. This isn't valid as far as the specification is concerned. But it worked because of the way that Babel was transpiling your code. And this is why I say it's not entirely advisable for you to learn like future JavaScript features by looking at transpiled code, because sometimes they're doing some optimizations to make it easier or more performant or something. So in Babel version 6, if I wanted to get Baz from foo, I would first have to import the default of foo that we're exporting here, and then I could destructure Baz off of foo. Yeah, so that was a real pain. And if you look at that blog post, kcd.im/tiers, it will also show you like some of the quirks that you have to deal with when working with CommonJS and combining CommonJS with the ES6 modules. So definitely something that you might look at. So here I have some resources on my slide. The specification, if you want a light read, you can go check that out. And on this last slide, I have a couple links. One of them is a feedback link, and I would really appreciate it if you could submit feedback. Thank you very much. You can ask me questions in the hall after. I'll just go right out there. So, thank you.
Chris. Oh, yeah. Do you have 2 mics by any chance, or are we gonna have to?
We don't have 2.
I think we can probably.
If you could, quicker than otherwise, I went upstairs in the facility, so I'm locked again.
What do you think?
Did you talk about export default as something from something?
I don't think I've seen this here, and that's kind of a very useful thing. Like you have a lot of modules that export default, and you want an index file, and so what you do usually is you export default from
You're
that
right, I
module
didn't
as
show
something.
that. Yeah.
That's something I found a lot of people need but don't know about.
Yeah, I actually haven't really used that a whole lot. And honestly, I haven't even used the export star very much either.
Yeah, the export star I've never used, but that case I've seen a lot of people actually need it. So what they would do is they would have a list of lines of import as like some variable, import default as some variable, and then they would have at the end an export, like exporting that list.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I need to update my slides to add that. Thanks for the feedback.
It was there or not.
No, thank you for the feedback. That's great.
Yeah, the JS conference channel. Yeah, and then it'll have screen and watch one.
Sure.
You know why? I read that like no.
That's right.
Do you know why that is? I tried to read about it. I didn't.
Yeah, so it's a really difficult problem to detect whether a module is using ES6 modules in a performant way. And so